Hello, my name is Matthias Klang. I work at UMass Boston, and I'm very upset that I haven't been able to make it to Japan. But I'm very happy that I get a chance to present some of my thoughts in the area of autoveillance, which I think is a very important and a quite unique challenge to the privacy regime we've been looking at thus far. My interest in the idea of autoveillance I've been tinkering with it for a couple of years, wanting to develop it, as many of us want to develop our ideas, but not having the time and the impetus. Just sort of like using it as this thought experiment while I present and lecture. It was, though, in 2015, Steve Mann, the inventor of surveillance and body cams in general, wrote this tweet that basically says autoveillance is basically surveillance, also known as quantifies self or body hacking. It's part of his declaration, and it's an interesting thought that we will only have, that there's no difference between these two, and I don't mean to critique him theoretically for a tweet, but it is a position that is being taken, that we don't really have to concern ourselves as much with the idea of autoveillance as we do with other forms of surveillance. A little background again about Steve Mann, if you don't know, he's a professor, and he's basically the inventor of the concept, the term, and the technology of surveillance. This is, if you go to the Wikipedia page and look at surveillance, it's his daughter's drawing that is used as an illustration of the term and concept. So he is like the guy here. So I was very concerned that my little idea that was undeveloped was being critiqued or discussed or denied by Professor Mann. So I was worried about this. But mostly, after a brief moment of thinking that no, there's nothing to do here, I came back to the idea that autoveillance is basically just surveillance. And I found that no, that didn't really fit well with my idea and the theoretical standpoints that we take when we look at surveillance, and actually now autoveillance. So if we look, for example, at the understanding of surveillance, and I'm not going to give you too much of a background here because many of us know this stuff and there's also not enough time, we look at the concepts of surveillance as a form of exercise of power. Jeremy Bentham famously designed a jail system based around surveillance, which would take away the need for many guards and keep people under control by allowing them to internalize their own surveillance. In other words, the individual under surveillance is the person who guards him or herself. Michel Foucault developed this idea in his book Discipline and Punish, where he showed and argued that the panopticon must not be understood as a dream building. It is the diagram of a mechanism of power reduced to its ideal form. In other words, surveillance and the surveillance systems are mechanisms of power and must be understood as such. The term surveillance, of course, is the view from above. The SUR is the French word for above, so it's the view from above or from a centralized point. The concept of surveillance, which Steve Mann put forward, is the opposite of this. It is the inverting of power. It is the ways in which individuals can look to the power structures and keep them under some form of control by looking at what they're doing. Here we have a picture. For example, we are taking photographs of all license plates that stop to buy drugs and give them to the police. In other words, it is the policing through surveillance by individuals. This is an interesting one, but more commonly we see the technology of being able to carry out surveillance becoming cheaper and more widespread and more individuals actually taking part in surveillance systems. The most common group of these are the unfortunate beatings by police, but the surveillance by ordinary individuals who will take out their webcam, not the webcam, sorry, their phones, and they will record the transgressions of the police, which have led in many cases to the police being penalized. This is the police as the powerful and the individuals as the powerless, and instead of the police having the power of surveillance, it is the public that has the power of surveillance. So the power and surveillance are very close together, and in fact, when we start talking about autoveillance, we are talking very much about power as well. Some of the terms that are included in the concept of autoveillance are life logging or the quantified self, which are systems by which we can measure our lives and take stock of everything we do. A common form of quantified self or autoveillance is the recording of every aspect of our lives. How much we walk, how much we eat, how much we sleep, how much, all these things that are us. And they're sold as a form of empowerment. This is an example. This is a TED talk by Gary Wolfe on the quantified self, where he presents the quantified self. For quantified self, knowledge is power, and knowledge about oneself easily translates as a tool for self-improvement. And I'm not disagreeing with this. I think that, yes, there is an element of knowledge is power and self-improvement is possible. Once we know the facts, we can change the facts. Even if I think that may be a bit positive, just simply knowing something doesn't imply that things will change. The quantified self, life logging, the autoveillance, it's a wide range of different technologies and the systems that come into play. And we see things like activity monitors, sleep trackers, diet and weight apps, but also more broadly, the ability to send away DNA samples and have your whole DNA mapped out, and your aptitudes for certain things or your ethnic background being presented as data to you. That's also a form of autoveillance. There are also the photo loggers, which are usually little wearable cameras that will take photos every so often and then collect them into some form of usable data for the person who has been taking the pictures. But bigger than that, we also see life logging and autoveillance in the actual practice of social media, where we present versions of ourselves and thoughts in our daily lives and maybe the food we are eating to a wider audience. We are both taking the pictures or transmitting the data, but we're also recording what we are doing. If you are Facebook users, this comes back in a regular feature when you see the memory function that's being used again and again. So these are the basic areas where I want to look, and my approach is to take to look at the 4 issues that I find particularly interesting and different for autoveillance as opposed to surveillance and surveillance. In other words, the view from above and the view from below. And these 4 issues are that set autoveillance apart are consent, other people's data, passive surveillance, and proportions. And I will be going through all of these and trying to explain what I mean here. So when we come to consent, this is probably the key issue with surveillance. When we have privacy legislation, it usually focuses or tries to focus around the concept of consent. did we agree to this privacy violation? Do we accept that we are under surveillance? There are several situations where we do not have to give our consent or agree to being under surveillance, but they are usually tasks set out by the government for some higher purpose. In other words, you do not have to give consent to the police a drug dealer does not have to give consent to the police for a stakeout. Quite obvious. But in most cases, we will be asked if we will give our consent to have our privacy taken away from us or to be under surveillance. This is has become standard procedure in many of our apps and many of our technologies. So we now just sort of click agree on any kind of licensing agreement without reading the whole full implications of what we're doing. So that's one of the consent issues that is really important here. And it runs through the whole discussion. The next one was other people's data. And for other people's data, it's interesting to point out that when we do something, when we post something, when we track something, very often we are not without context. And because we are not without context, we are also including other people in the ways in which we are recording stuff. So, for example, here's a picture that I've taken. It's a selfie. And you can see there are other people in the picture with me. Not everyone seems to be equally amused. Even if we don't look at pictures on social media, a lot of the other people's data issue comes up when we just post information which we think is solely about one thing, but includes other information advertently or inadvertently. So, for example, one of the discussions that's been around the last couple of years is in what way does the use of digital photography impact on wildlife when, for example, poachers are able to look at the images and take and extract the geodata from them to find animals that are attractive and endangered. So this is one of the interesting areas. Finally, on the area of other people's data, I want to look at the problem of DNA, which is a huge discussion here. It comes to the question of whose data is it? I mean, I can send away to have my DNA mapped and explained and demonstrated and illustrated, but it's not mine alone. When I gather data, when I get the data from my DNA, I know I have got a lot of information about my parents, about my siblings, and about my children. This data is not mine alone. And even if I've given consent because I'm interested to find out, what does it mean that I get the data of others around, especially of others around me? So these are questions that need to be looked into more deeply. And a final note on this, on other people's data, is the way in which the data can be used in ways that we don't think about, or in ways we hadn't expected, even if we don't actually transmit it. There are a couple of interesting cases that are beginning to pop up about people's data being used to basically prove that they were lying. In one very, very extreme case here, the data from a Fitbit was used to prove that the Fitbit's owner, a woman, was not raped. In other words, the story she put forward was that she was attacked while she was asleep, and the police extracted the data from her Fitbit and found out that she was not asleep at the time. So this undermines her story. But in this case, we see the concept of autoveillance being used as a form of passive surveillance, where we are collecting the data and it can be subpoenaed and used against us. On the question of proportions, the measuring of ourselves is an important aspect of the life logging process. It's discussed in the terms of that knowledge is power, and with this power we can become self-empowered and we can change our habits. But what it's also doing is that it's collecting a lot of anonymous data and aggregating it into what is the correct behavior in a certain setting or the incorrect behavior in a certain setting. So on a simple level, we can look at this and say, well, when we take a selfie, we look through the images and find the one that best matches our idea of who we think we are, and we put that online if we are so inclined. The process of rejecting the pictures we don't like is a form of surveillance and an exercise of power against ourselves. We are choosing not to like these things that we already are visual representations of ourselves. So that's one part. The ways in which we do this means we can develop norms and ideas that this is what you should and shouldn't be doing. Much in the same way as we can say things like the average height of a Swedish man is, I don't know how much, but we have these statistics, or the average life expectancy of a Belgian woman is this much. So all these statistics that are aggregated become the norm, and if we don't live up to that norm, we have somehow failed. And in some cases, if we live beyond, or if we surpass that norm, we are even better. So it becomes this competitive edge and a judgment on whether we are doing the right thing. This becomes more complicated when we even start to log the abstract. In this question, we see a very interesting area where we look at the ways in which we are now gathering data about how we sleep. So many of the sleep trackers, which have been around for quite some time now, put forward an idea of what sleep is. So they measure the ways in which we sleep, and they will report to us that we are sleeping properly or improperly. The question, of course, is where does their judgment of what proper sleep come from? The interesting thing, of course, is that we have for the longest time had this idea of 8 hours of sleep is some sort of magic number or norm that we should be having. But if you go and look at the way sleep patterns of individuals in the pre-industrial age, we actually find that they had two distinct sleeps, which they actually talked about with the first sleep and the second sleep. There's a wonderful quote here from Don Quixote, where Miguel Cervantes writes, "Don Quixote followed nature, and being satisfied with his first sleep, did not solicit more. As for Sancho, he never wanted a second, for the first lasted him from night to morning." This is just one example, and if you're interested in the topic, the historian Eckrich has written a wonderful book called At Night's Close, Night in Times Past, where he shows quite conclusively that the idea of the 8-hour sleep, or in fact the one continuous night's sleep, is a new construct. So what I'm saying with this, what I'm trying to argue with this, is that the trackers are indeed looking at the ways in which we do things. And in the case of sleep, we can find a lot of trackers that are looking at the best sleep. But what does it mean when the tracker monitors all these things? When we monitor all these parts of our body or our practices like sleep, and then arrive at the conclusion that this is the way you should be doing it. There's a normative suggestion here. This is the way you should be doing it. And if you're not, you're somehow failing as a sleeper or an eater or whatever you want to be. So the interesting thing here is that the anonymized, aggregated data is being used to present some sort of norm, which then becomes normative to the people who are interested in these questions. We are then internalize them and use them to measure ourselves against. So, for example, if you're a person who, if we continue on this sleep example, who fails at sleeping for 8 hours a night, you are failing at being a good sleeper, which means you are somehow lacking in this sense. You will then punish yourself for being lacking in that area. So this area, the self-surveillance, goes beyond what other people would know, because only you, or the user, knows about this and can find the information and punish yourself for it. So in closing, if we look at the idea of surveillance being about power and surveillance about being changing who has that power, but still in terms of power, autoveillance is different. It is about putting. It's not about putting power in someone else's hands, because the user who carries out the process of autoveillance is not actually empowered with this knowledge. They are empowered with the knowledge in one way. In other words, if they want to find out how much they are sleeping and they find it out, they will gain knowledge from this. But they are not empowered in the sense they can exercise that power on some subject. And that is the interesting question here. So, from the perspective of the privacy researcher and the lawyer, autoveillance is not the same as surveillance. We need to work to deepen our understanding of privacy protections for the practice of autoveillance. We need to be better at understanding what the power structures are involved in the process of self-monitoring. And that's which makes it a very, very interesting field of study, and an important one that needs to be looked at in more detail. Thank you very much.